That's what I'm looking for, the charger.
I think the idea of this is that you make mistakes.
Actually, there is one thing. If you are taking notes, it is much easier to take notes.
All right, welcome everybody. This is the Secure Asset Transfer Protocol BOF. We may have a short discussion, or we may have a long one, so I'm going to get started, assuming we might have a long one. I'm Wes Hardiker, for those that don't know me, and there's a mailing list for this. There is a little bit of discrepancy in terms of what this group is called. It was originally called SAT, and the mailing list is called SAT, but the BOF is called SAT-P, with the P for protocol. So don't let that confuse you. Some of the slides might say one thing, and the other slides might say another thing. It's still the same thing.
And this is Roman Canelli, one of the SecADs, to explain why we had to do that. There were some data tracker things that we wanted to have slightly longer names than 3-letter acronyms.
Yep. So it's all good. This is the agenda for today. We'll start off. I'll rant for a little bit about stuff. Then we're going to have the brunt of the material, which will be both problem statements and assumptions, some use cases on how this is expected to be used, as well as a protocol overview for where the work might start from with an initial draft that then need to be later adopted by the working group should it go forward. We'll have an open discussion after that, and where people can bring other stuff. Note that the 3 sections of questions following those other presentations are really just clarifying questions. We're not going to get into the brunt of, is this a good idea, or does this belong in the IETF until later? We need to get through those 3 presentations and understand the background first. And the charter discussion should say 20 minutes. I thought I changed that. Apparently I didn't. We do have a draft charter. It's on the mailing list, and there's some on the slides. And then, of course, we'll have the standard ending of a BOF of, is this a good idea, and should the work proceed in the IETF? I'm sure most of you have at least seen the note well. I don't know how many of you have read the note well, but basically there's some legal ramifications of participating in the IETF. Specifically around patents. I'm not a lawyer, so I won't dive into it too much. We have a bunch of documents that talk about this, that talk about everything from how the standards process works, to how working groups work, to anti-harassment procedures and code of conduct and copyright and patents and stuff. Everybody needs to be aware of that, especially if you're representing your company. Our code of conduct guidelines, especially this, really holds true for BOFs. Things can get heated in a BOF if differing opinions, kind of come around. So remember to treat everybody with respect. Speak slowly, like I am not doing. Limit the use of slang. Use English that most people will understand. Dispute ideas using reasoned argument. In other words, don't say that that's a horrible idea. Explain why you think it's a horrible idea. Use your best engineering judgment, and then find the best solution that works for the whole internet. The IETF is designed to work for the whole internet, not just a segment of the internet, and contribute to the ongoing work. Note that the IETF has a masking policy for this IETF. Everybody should be wearing a mask unless you are taking a sip. No taking 1-hour-long drinks, that does not count. I've seen people do that. So, the cases really have been rising. Some of the IETF staff are sick. It's actually not good. So please, everybody, keep your masks up.
Wes, you're actually misstating the policy. There's no exception for eating and drinking in these rooms.
Thank you.
And Dan, that means you. I'm serious. Put your mask on. You're doing this all week.
All right. So if you're in question, go read the policy on the website. That's actually the authoritative source. Not me or Eckert, for that matter. The wording on the website is correct. And Eckert's probably quoting it correctly because he always does. The IETF tool, so if you want to speak in the room, please do use the QR code over there to log in. You need to log in with the data tracker. And we will be using only people at the queue. So lining up with the mic won't do well. You need to make sure you use the queue by clicking on the little button in the agenda, or you can scan the QR code. Either one of those will work. We will be doing queue order because we have a lot of remote people too. In general, BOFs have a particular goal, right? We need to decide, does this problem need solving? Is the IETF the right place for it? Are there enough people interested in doing the work? Is the scope well designed? Is it too big? Is it too small? Are the deliverables right? Do we think that this is what should come out of the working group, for it to succeed? And if we do put all those other things together, will it actually succeed? We think that there's a good chance of success. And this is all documented in RFC 5434, which is a great document for bots in general, but really about getting work started. So back to the agenda. This is the agenda, and we are going to go on to Thomas with the problem statements and assumptions.
Can everybody hear me okay? Do I need to? Oh.
You need to get pretty close.
Hello? Okay.
And it should be, it said a new one was opening.
Let me not. Okay. Should I try it again, guys?
I think you may have, did you load the wrong set of
Yeah, I might
slides?
have done that, yeah. Okay, is it moving?
It takes a second.
Okay.
Maybe I need to unshare first.
Give us a second, folks. Okay, I'm just gonna wait until that thing says.
Yeah, I'm granting you, but it's not.
Otherwise, you could just move the slides forward. Let me try it.
Let's actually revoke you. Now try it.
Yep. This is,
Well, it said that before to us.
okay, I'm pressing share.
Give it a second because it can take a bit, but it shouldn't take that long. Let me try it from my side instead.
Yeah. Maybe just, yeah, it's probably easy if you drive it.
Yeah,
Okay.
see, that worked. But
Okay.
you can still request access if you want.
Sure. So I'm going to talk about just the problem definition and the assumptions that we're going into this. Okay, so this slide and the next slide is a diagram, is terminology. So this is particularly important because we want to keep the discussion sort of generic. So I'm using the word network as a group of nodes that share state about a digital asset. And you're going to turn around and say, what's the digital asset? That's the second one. And why is it important? Because there's this notion of validity.
Just take the mic out.
Okay. Okay, that's better. So, okay. Is this sounding better for folks?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. I won't sing. So, but I'll just speak. I promise. So validity means that the data object is legally recognized, and the word legal is, we can talk about that later, which means it has some economic value that's been, legally recognized within, say, a jurisdiction to have value. Gateway is a computer that's authorized to act on behalf of the network, and asset transfer is the protocol to move the asset from one network to the other. So this is the general picture that refers, that we talked about in the previous slide. Okay. So moving forward, so problem statement. What we want is an interop protocol that permits the movement of a digital asset from one network to the other. And we have some conditions, and that is that we have to do this while retaining the validity of the digital asset. And it has to be done in such a way that when there's a third party independent that is asked to verify post-transfer, of course, that they can do that. There's sufficient evidence for somebody to come in to say, yes, this is true, this is not true, because there's always, system failures, and so there's always cases where disputes occur. So that's kind of the condition. It's at least one condition. So assumptions. So we assume that both networks at least share common semantics about what the data object is and the notion of validity. So, and this notion of validity is going to come up again. It really depends on the legal jurisdiction of where that network operates. We assume one or both networks are opaque, meaning that we assume that you can't see into the resources, into the constructs in the network. So I'm using the analogy of routing where you have an ISP network, and an ISP is not going to let you look into all the subnets within the ISP network. It's the same concept. This is the autonomous systems principle concept. The gateways are trusted, so we can talk about that later, but it's trusted to do this one thing and only that thing. Information subsets, or what we call views, may be shared. So views are not asset transfer. Views is just an abstract of an information that's queried to a gateway. So you could say, hey, gateway, I know you've got, behind you there's this type of network. I want to ask you about this particular state of an object in that network, and the gateway is going to respond, digitally signed and so on, right? So it's not a transfer. The key thing is that it's just information. So what we want to do just is use the gateway model, because we've got a lot of lessons learned from the history of the internet. Many people don't realize the internet is not one long contiguous network. There's lots of networks in between. There's backbone networks, and in many cases, the interconnection point between two networks are in fact implemented by some gateway, gateway function. So we assume there's one or more gateways in front of each network. Of course, a gateway needs to peer with another gateway to actually run the secure asset transfer protocol. And we assume the gateway hides the complexity or the uniqueness of the network behind it. And that's consistent with the opaque networks principle. And so our proposed area of work in the IETF is the yellow. It looks green on the screen here, but it's the yellow bit there in the middle, right? So it's between gateway and G1 and G2. We don't care, or it's out of scope for us, how the network is defined, what is the network, and so on and so on. And if we do the gateway protocol correctly, it's possible that one of the networks or both of them could in fact be monolithic systems, right? So think about, existing, I don't say, banking systems, RTGS, clearing systems that some of you might be aware of. It could be one of them, could be both of them, right? So we almost don't care. It just, our focus is between G1 and G2. And how G1 deals with network NW1, how G2 deals with network 2 is out of scope. So it's if you are implementing a gateway, it's your job to figure out how it's gonna, you need an adapter, a connector, whatever, with the network behind you. And why is this? Because there's just too many networks. There's too many network types. So it's just it's just too much work. So we want to look at three particular modes. We just called it modes. First one is asset transfer. Second one is this data sharing. So there's a gateway, there's an API. If you're authorized to ask a particular question, you go to that API. And it's not an asset transfer, you're just extracting information. The third one, which is down the road somewhere, sometime, it's going to be what we call asset exchange or asset swap, which is a coordinated swap that's occurring through the two gateways. The scope of work: API endpoint definitions, resource identifiers, the message payloads, the message format, the message flows. So for the flows, we are looking at the classic 3PC, three-phase commit. This is classic database textbook. If you're in college, this is database 1 or database 2. Of course, for those people who don't know what the 2PC, 3PC is, and there's the ACID properties. There's also classic properties. Just Google it, you'll find what ACID stands for. And of course, we care very much about the security and the liveness protocol properties of the protocol. Okay, so current main technical drafts, we have an architecture draft, we have a protocol draft, and we actually have a use cases draft that's not yet uploaded, but we have material for use cases, and in fact we are looking for people to provide us with use cases that that would be useful for the discussion. Is that my last slide? I think that's my last slide.
Okay, so with that, we'll take a clarifying question. So as I mentioned, coming up next is some discussion about use cases on where this is envisioned, and then followed by that as an early protocol description. So if your questions about those, do table them until later. Dave, please.
Dave Taylor, and I could have saved my question for the next presentation, but I looked at the slides and the question is actually more appropriate on the slides on this one. So if you don't mind, if you can go back to the terminology slide so I can ask my clarifying question. While you're doing that, let me prefix it with a question I think is answered so you can see where I'm coming from on my clarifying question. It has to do with which types of assets are in scope here, right? There's three types of assets. You might think pure digital, things that have no reality in the real world. There are things that are pure physical, and there are things that are hybrid. And hybrid, I mean things like the keys to the physical device, right? The digital keys for there. And I'm interpreting digital asset as being those two categories, but not the pure physical one. But it could be the digital asset that is the proof of possession or proof of ownership of something. Okay. So that would then lead to my actual clarifying question. Okay. Because if I look at asset transfer here, there are two types of asset transfer, voluntary and involuntary. Elliot Lear gave a great presentation, I think it was in one of the IoT meetings, I think at last IETF, about involuntary ownership transfer, which more typically shows up in the hybrid case, but can show up in the pure digital as well. And we're talking about lawful repossession, lawful confiscation, lawful foreclosure, things like that, okay? So my question is, are those in scope? Because according to this slide, the answer would be yes. If you go forward a slide, the answer is where you talk about, the notion of a gateway or whatever tends to imply that the answer is no, but maybe that's because you're jumping into solution here, but this is the problem statement thing. So my question is involuntary asset transfer of digital assets, is that part of the architecture or not part of the architecture? This is the problem statement. I'm asking which problem you're trying to solve.
So two questions. The first question is the type of asset, yes, the digital or hybrid, it's out of scope for us right now because we assume that the applications, the two sides, know what they talk about the same asset. And so we've had discussions about how do you identify an asset. There is, in fact, industry efforts to provide numbers. There's an ITIN number for digital assets that's being developed. So gateway G1 needs to tell gateway G2, it's this one, it's this asset. G2 will then look up, okay, this is, yes, it's valid, it's legally recognized in the UK, great, but guess what? My network can't accept it.
I like your statement about legally recognized, and that's exactly what begs my question, right? Legal recognition entails involuntary as well.
So the second question, voluntary, involuntary, that's, to me, right now, it's out of scope. The gateway is responding to a call to do something, and the caller has authorization, so it's going to do it.
Okay, this is the problem statement presentation. Gateways are part of the solution. If the problem you're trying to solve is also to do involuntary, then that dictates whether and how you use gateways, right? I'm trying to not use the word gateway in my question because I don't consider that to be a problem statement. I consider that to be a solution to a problem, right? The problem is, do you want to do involuntary digital asset transfer or not? And it sounds like your answer is you do not. Okay, all of that may be a question for the scope of the BOF when we get to the scoping
I think
question.
it's a scope because right now we haven't actually talked about that, right? We just said, okay, is this going to happen between G1 and G2?
It is a good scope question.
It's a good scope question. Yeah. Thank you, Dave.
Eric?
Yeah, so I'm trying to also understand, I'm having trouble with a little abstract. So should I be thinking NFTs in this conversation?
Is that an asset? Is that a legally, does the SEC recognize that as an asset?
Who knows?
Who knows? So this is why it's out of scope.
Should I be thinking Bitcoins?
Is it an asset? So
I'm getting somewhere, but I'm trying to have a reference point.
So use cases is coming up next. I'll remind you.
Use cases.
But
Okay, I do understand that. Okay, so you use the word verifiable and use the word trusted. I'm trying to understand how those interact. So what I mean by that is that in many networks of types where you use Bitcoins or NFTs, they're constructed in a way that they're not supposed to be non-trusted, which is to say that there's no entity which can involuntarily transfer your asset from one to another, right? And so my question is, is the gateway in this case able to, is the gateway's transfer of this asset verifiable in a way that the ordinary asset transfers are verifiable inside the network or not?
So the gateway is trusted, and the gateway just obeys the command. So I
don't know what trusted means. Trusted is not like a word.
Well, it's an assumption. We can.
But that's not. Is it universally trusted?
It's trusted by the participants in the network.
Okay, so let me see if I understand this correctly. Forget about like Destination Network 2. I have an asset on network one. You're saying that the gateway can transfer my assets to Dave without my cooperation? That is a assessment.
I am not saying that. We're pushing that.
No, I mean, this is a very core scenario requirement. So like either it plays by the rules of these networks, which do not allow those things, or it does not play by the rules of these networks, which doesn't allow those things. Which one is it?
So it's not which one. It depends on the network. Is it a private closed network belonging to banks? Let's
assume it's the Bitcoin blockchain, the Ethereum blockchain.
I don't know.
This is like a core problem statement question.
So let me propose
Yes, I agree.
let me propose something for this block today, right? That because the involuntary voluntary scope is going to become a problem. And so I think that today we should concentrate on a voluntary transfer where two networks that trust each other, and I know, right?
But networks don't trust. Networks don't have that property. So that's not a property.
Two different banks using SWIFT, right, have some level of trust when they're talking to each other, from what I understand. This is very similar, right? One gateway has trust that another one is going to act in that they have an agreement in place. Maybe it's backed by legal. That's out of scope. How to define that trust is out of scope. So and I'm not a proponent, but my vision of when they started this is that we start with a small building block, and the expansion into how do you define what each network looks like and how do you define what all of that is, you get the protocol between the gateways first.
But that doesn't work because the structure of these systems requires that the protocol embody those owner transfer requirements as part of it. That's what I'm saying. It's like if you have systems which are like zero trust systems, which some systems are, some are not, then the asset transfers have to embody this protocol has to embody this asset transfer. The whole thing falls apart. If you look at like side chains on side chains on Bitcoin, right? They embody the Bitcoin network. And so
we're not doing Bitcoin. Just so the audience understand, okay? So we're not doing Bitcoin.
Okay.
This is out of scope. You can go.
Oh, Bitcoin's out of scope. Okay, right. So are blockchains in general out of scope?
And then voluntary. That's why we're calling it network.
So the definition of what is a digital asset or what is transferable is out of scope, right? So we're not talking about any particular form. It doesn't say that it couldn't be used for Bitcoin or it couldn't be used to transfer the thing that came up in IAB Open just a bit ago, right? Was I have a movie that I bought with one vendor. I want to digitally transfer my movie to a friend, right? Give it to them, sell it, maybe to a completely different vendor. But now, those two parties, say Amazon and Google, need to make positive assurance that when I transfer it, I no longer have access to it.
Okay, well, I guess I'll sit down until it's your discussion, but this is so abstract, I can't understand it.
Fair enough. So I think at the open mic is when we'll come back to the bigger question of, is this tractable or not? Right? Colin?
Okay, so my question is slightly related to these ones, but I don't think it quite got answered. I think it might be easier and fitting your thing. Can you just define a little bit more when you say trusted, what you mean by trusted? And I don't care about the gateways trusting each other. I don't care about the other gateway, the other network. What does it mean on this diagram that network one trusts gateway one? Like what do you mean by that part of word trust in that context?
So the participants in network one agreed that they authorized G1 to do some
transfer, whatever the process is,
on behalf of the members, a member of network one.
Okay, on behalf of any member in network one, or
of any member of network one.
Yes. Okay, so I think look, I mean that really helps me resolve the problem statement. Is G1 is trusted by every member of network one to do any transfer of any asset in network one, right? That's sort of what we mean by trusted here. Okay.
Voluntary.
Robert?
Did I just do it?
Well, I'm back at the mic then. So, what would voluntary even mean? I mean, it seems that your definition you provided of trusted, which I think is fine for the context of this, it removes all possibility of you even knowing whether it's voluntary or involuntary. Like G1 just does it. And that's pretty much what you said before, right? It takes the command and it does it.
So the originator in network one has to authorize G1 to do the transfer. Something has to trigger it. G1 is not just randomly pick up somebody's asset and then move it across. Somebody has to, tell G1.
I mean, but that's different than what you just told me. You said that G1 can, yeah, so G1 probably wouldn't do something unless somebody triggered it. But if G1 wanted to just do something with no trigger, like it's trusted to do it. It is trusted to make any
So
yeah,
we
okay.
can talk about the definition of trusted, later on, because this is not a discussion of trust or trustlessness or so on. This is a
Maybe, but I think your whole problem statement is about trust and what trust means of who's allowed to make these transactions to move something from point A to point B. It's about trust.
Okay, thanks.
Robert
Alicia.
Wilton, Alicia, you're not in actually. You didn't click the button and to get in
Oh.
queue.
My phone
I'll
doesn't
let you.
work.
Can you go after Philip, and I'll let you in.
Rob Wilton, Cisco. So I just want to question to clarify about what allowed failure modes are here. So is it acceptable for this transaction to fail and require like human intervention to sort it out?
So the question is it allowed to fail? Yeah. So we anticipate there's several points in the 3PC that could fail. Right?
And fail
That
and
means say that one of the gateways dies.
okay.
Or somebody hacks it. Something goes wrong, and one of them either dies or refuses to move forward on the flow, and just aborts.
Okay. And when you say abort, does it mean that you expect the asset to remain in the first network, or is it that it could end up being assets in neither network?
So that's what they're trying to avoid. That the asset properties, if we follow it properly, it guarantees that it's in one of the networks, not both, or it's not lost. Because we don't want lost.
It guarantees under some circumstances, like unbounded network delay and things like that. Okay.
So that's why we put ACID. That's classic database, transactions. That, that you have to have the state in when you move a copy of the data, it has to arrive in all nodes or not node. Anyway, we can bring the whole ACID thing offline.
Yeah, and it's like when you transfer money between countries and things, it's possible the money goes from A to B, or it just gets lost, and you have to then phone people up and say, "Where's my money?" So it's not like it's guaranteed to either be in your source account or the destination account. You can end up failing.
We're trying to minimize the window of that occurring.
So my question is, can it fail at all? So is it like that's not allowed? You're never allowed to fail, or there's some circumstances where it might fail? And it's a problem statement
We know
question.
circumstances where it can fail. I'll just be quite honest. There's no 100% bulletproof,
Okay, so it's in scope.
Yeah.
Roman.
Hi, Roman Danilu, Carnegie Mellon University. Just to clarify what I think is a simple question, from the perspective of SAT, when we say asset, it's just a blob.
It's just a blob. That's why we call it data object.
Okay, so opaque. Okay, thanks.
Dave.
Dave Thaler, you used the term legally recognized. My clarifying question is, do you assume that everything in this diagram, both sides of the transaction, have the same definition of legally recognized?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. This is the problem that in phase 0, if you look at
Okay,
the
because
architecture,
that's just another way of phrasing the sort of questions
That's
that
right.
Ecker and I were both asking, right?
That's right.
Because trusted by one side doesn't mean trusted by the other side if you say that they have different definitions of legally recognized.
trusted to behave, properly per our protocol
Okay.
definition.
So if you explicitly say, so I'm just making sure, the answer is you explicitly want to cover cases where there are different definitions of legal, so in that case, they may not have agreement
Correct.
on who owns it.
So
I think that's a very hard problem,
Yeah.
and you might want to back off on that and say legally recognized across the entire set of
Okay.
things. I think that one might be tractable.
Okay, got it.
Philip.
Phil?
Phil Hambaker, yeah. Going back to the involuntary transfers thing, the ability to support an involuntary transfer is a property of networks. So if you've got an origin network that is tracking an asset that isn't capable of doing an involuntary transfer, then bolting this stuff on isn't going to give you that capability. And there's no way that our spec here can provide a way to do that involuntary transfer. So I don't think that that's a problem for us. Regulatory wise, I think that anything that doesn't support involuntary transfer is probably going to get banned.
All right.
And should be.
Alicia, did you want to say something? I told you you could be in the queue there. She's still around? Oh, yep, okay.
My apology, I didn't follow the protocol. My phone doesn't work, but I think I agree the definition, like rigorousness. But I think we should let them present their case rather than beating them down. My understanding.
This is good stuff. This is good stuff, by the way. I appreciate it very much.
My understanding is that the two gateways actually authenticated each other. Let's not use the bigger words if the smaller one can work. They authenticated and they agreed to transfer this block. That's it. And let's not dive deeper than that.
Thank you. Sorry. Big words. Okay.
Okay. Can you return control of the, stop sharing, so there we go.
Okay, can everybody hear me? Right. So yeah, let me make a presentation. I imagine we'll have some questions from the same lines that Thomas faced. So I'll try to address them later. Okay, next slide, please.
Can you speak up, please?
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right, very good. Okay, so I work for IBM Research, and I'm going to try and motivate some use cases for you, which are the kinds of cases we have been encountering for the past few years. So in IBM Research and IBM in general, we've been building over the past few years a lot of solutions around business networks, especially in the supply chain area. So what you see here is, again, the first bullet point, promise of open networks, one network to rule them all, it's just an allusion to Ethereum. You can think of one big system that aimed to manage all possible digital assets and all possible workflows in the world. We think that's not going to be possible. You have different kinds of technologies built on different kinds of principles, either centralized, decentralized. You can build networks on in different ways, and those networks can solve different purposes. Like, for example, you see here, there are networks that we have built that handle trade logistics, for example. So one example I'll give you is TradeLens. It's a system that IBM built with Maersk and involved other exporters and shipping carriers and connected all of them to manage mainly shipping logistics. That is all the documentation involving the export of goods from one country to another, passing through a carrier and making sure that all regulations are followed. There are networks we built for trade finance. That is, if you all know about the counterparty risk in the export-import problem, trade finance is a way to mitigate that problem. That is, does the exporter transfer the goods first, or does the importer pay for the goods first? Because whichever side blinks first, I mean, the other side stands at risk, right? So trade finance has, over the past few centuries, people have come up with solutions such as the letters of credit to make sure that exporters, importers can safely conduct trades without losing out in the process, and that involves banks. So we have built some networks from that. We built networks, we built demonstrations on how to share KYC information across different banks who are part of a single network. And then you can also have networks built to track the provenance of food, like there's a network called IBM Food Trust. So all of these networks, they were built according to philosophy which involved minimal scope. So the various enterprises that already had processes to run these different things like trade finance or logistics or provenance, they did not want to rush headlong into building big networks, solving all of the activities that their organizations did. So you ended up building networks just for trade logistics, just for trade finance, just to track provenance of of goods and supply chain and so on. So that's what we call minimum viable ecosystems. So that's a reality. You have these different kinds of networks that are there, and they might also be built on different kinds of platforms underneath, built on and they can be either centralized, decentralized, or what have you. So what we end up with are a lot of these different networks. And by the way, these networks, many of them can be either open access or they can also be permission. That is, they have gatekeepers. Usually it's a consortium which guards who can join the network and who's privy to the information within. So you have these processes and you have the assets that these processes manage within these respective networks. What kind of fragmentation are we talking about here? So there's horizontal fragmentation. For example, you can have trade finance networks. I'll give you two examples. There's a network called B-Trade, there's a network called Marco Polo. B-Trade is built on a platform called Hyperledger Fabric. Marco Polo is built on a platform called Corda. And they both are trying to solve the same problem, that they're bringing together banks and exporters and importers and managing trade finance. But they have different groups of banks, different clientele. Now, what happens if you have you want to, let's say, move from one network to the other? You have to make sure that the letter of credit created in one network is understandable, or it can be moved to a different network. Not really possible in this fragmented world. So the horizontal fragmentation is different networks solving similar purposes, but handling different clientele. So because people want to have flexibility in terms of what networks they affiliate with, you need to be able to bridge that gap. Vertical fragmentation is about a network like TradeLens managing trade logistics, and you have a network like B-Trade managing trade finance. Both of these processes are not independent in the real world. You have trade finance drives trade logistics drives trade finance, and I'll come to that in a second. But you have these networks built on, they can be built on this same kind of platform. TradeLens and B-Trade are both built on Hyperledger Fabric. So these networks need to connect with each other in order to be able to securely transfer assets or communicate asset states between each other. That's another kind of fragmentation. So let me come to a concrete example. Go to the next slide. Okay, just compartmentalize your vision to the middle part. I call these seller and buyer, but you can think of them as being exporter and importer as well. So let's say an exporter and importer agree on a trade, and they come up with a purchase order. Let's say they have a common reference referring to that particular trade instance. And if you look at the network on the left, that's managing trade finance. Okay, so it's bringing together your seller, your buyer, and their respective banks, and it is running a process of letter of credit. What happens there? A buyer requests for a letter of credit from its bank proposes one, the seller's bank then approves it, and the seller is then later supposed to provide evidence that it shipped the goods, and that creates an obligation in the network system of record, and the buyer is supposed to pay it back. So that's really the workflow that is being run by these different parties in a typically in a decentralized manner, and the assets it's managing are letters of credit. That's really what you have on the books, and we will need that letter of credit to be somewhat more mobile. We cannot afford to have it just be siloed in this network, as we'll see in the next slide. The network on the right is managing trade logistics. Again, these are very simplified forms of what such networks do in the real world. Okay, so the network on the right, it's bringing together sellers and carriers. Seller is trying to is booking consignment on the network, dispatching it via carrier, and the carrier is then uploading this document called a bill of lading, which is proof that the seller shipped the goods. And usually in the trade financing world, bills of lading are provided as evidence that letter of credit, that the seller's part is fulfilled, that is, the exporter exported the goods. So now the importer is supposed to make a payment. So you have bills of lading being maintained in the records on the trade logistics network on the right. So where does secure asset transfer come in? You move to the next slide.
A lot of slides left, so you might want to.
Sorry?
You have a lot of slides left, so you might want to.
Sorry. Yeah, I'll rush through it. Okay. So what you see here is sort of a join of the two networks you saw on the previous slide. Trade finance network on the left, trade logistics on the right. And there's an inherent interdependency between these two processes. You can see, let me first go to the extra step that was added at the top, obtain bill of lading. So there's a bill of lading in the trade logistics network on the right. That is needed in the trade finance network in order for the seller to prove that they actually exported the goods. So how do you do that? That is really what we want to enable by allowing a cross-network protocol between the trade finance network and the trade logistics network that will allow the trade finance network to obtain a view of the bill of lading from the trade logistics network, and then that is what allows the business network to force an obligation on the buyer to pay the seller. Step 6, you can think of another the dependency on the other side, where the trade logistics network may want to use find out whether a valid letter of credit exists before it allows the seller to create a consignment. So these are real world use cases, and The trade finance network, as I give examples, you can think of B-Trade or Marco Polo and trade logistics network. Prime example is the trade lens network that's run mainly by Maersk, and IBM has built the technology for that. So you can see what's happening here is, in effect, the asset transfer protocol, or SATP, is allowing two different networks to interoperate with each other without forcing those two networks to join together in one, because that's a much harder thing to do. The two networks exist independently for a reason, and they do not want to necessarily merge their processes together for a lot of different reasons. These kind of protocols enable this to happen. And just in case you're wondering, this is just an example. Don't just fixate on the letter of credit or the bill of trading. This can be really anything, any kind of asset. The asset semantics are restricted to their respective networks. The protocol itself is communicating information, does not care about what those assets are. It just cares about the fact that information or assets are communicated securely between the two networks, and in this case, between the two gateways that are acting as spokespersons for the two networks. Next slide. Okay, I'm not going to go into this in detail, just showing that we can extrapolate the example I gave in the previous slide to encompass the entire supply chain lifecycle. We added two networks, food tracking network and payments network, and you can build a much bigger workflow spanning all of these different networks. You can even add a regulatory compliance network which manages KYC documents. Next slide. Okay, moving to a different kind of example. So past few years, maybe past couple of years, there's been a lot of interest in CBDC, right? So I'm not a finance expert, but what I understand from the whole CBDC, about the whole CBDC landscape, is that you can have two different kinds of central bank digital currency: the wholesale central bank digital currency and the retail CBDC. Wholesale CBDC involves the central or the reserve bank of a country allowing banks to maintain reserve currency accounts with it. So, and you can transfer reserve currency. The central bank can issue reserve currency to the commercial banks, or it can redeem it at some point as well. You have retail CBDC networks on the other hand, which involve various commercial banks and their clients, and may also involve central or reserve bank just acting as sort of a regulator or an auditor. So what can you? How is this a use case for that? You have commercial banks that maintain reserve accounts in the wholesale CBDC network. At some point, they may want to transfer that CBDC to the retail CBDC network in which they're participating. So how do you do that in a manner that is secure and which ensures that asset integrity is not messed up? What does it mean? As Thomas talked about in the previous presentation, you want to make sure that if if some CBDC gets burned in the wholesale CBDC network, it has to get recreated in the retail CBDC network. Otherwise, the protocol ought to fail. Atomicity is paramount here. Similarly, if a commercial bank is part of two different retail CBDC networks, you should be able to transfer CBDC across its accounts from one network to the other. So this provides an example of asset transfer. The previous example that I showed was more along the lines of communicating asset state information in order to link workflows across two different networks. Go to the next slide. Okay, I think I've kind of covered this is what I was talking about in the previous slide. So you have currency getting transferred from the wholesale to a retail CBDC network or across two different retail CBDC networks. So I'll stop here and take questions.
Hi, Roman Danilu, Carnegie Mellon University. Could you quickly just flip back to maybe slide 6, and in each one of those use cases, can you state the obvious where you expect Satp to be used? Where's Satp in this one and in the previous ones? Thanks.
Okay, in slide 6. All right. Okay. Maybe go back to the previous use case, the trade one, the one before. All right. Okay. So here, look at the steps highlighted in green, step 6 and step 11. Okay. Those are the steps that were not there in the previous diagram where I had the two networks disconnected from each other. So here, what is happening? You have a trade finance network running a gateway. You have trade logistics network running a gateway. In step 6, trade logistics network asks for the state of the state of a letter of credit referencing a particular purchase order, which is sort of refers to that particular trade instance. The trade finance network is supposed to then provide information for that along with some proof of authenticity. So that's really, it's what the information is and what the proof is, that's kind of beyond the scope of the gateways. Between the gateways, you're communicating this information, the query, according, you supply what's called a view address, and then you get a view of the letter of credit in response, and other stuff is happening behind the gateways. Similarly, for the bill of lading, this something similar is happening, but in the opposite direction.
So in the parlance of the tee-up in terms of the problem statement, Satp is 6 and 11 in data sharing mode?
Yes, correct.
Phil Hambaker, have you looked at the Bolero system? They've been doing electronic bill of ladings for 20 years.
Sure. Yeah, no, that's fine. I mean, what we are concerned about here is not how one particular system is processing these transactions in a secure and atomic manner. But see, the thing is, we have seen a lot of these different systems coming up, a lot of different networks emerging the past few years. And we don't think that there will suddenly emerge one killer network on which everybody will just move their assets and run their workflows. So we recognize that there is institutional staying power to a lot of these networks and the assets that they maintain. And we want to ensure interoperability between them. That's really our primary goal. Michael.
Yeah, thanks so much. Definitely recognize the complexity of the problem. And yeah, sorry, Michael Prorock speaking. I work pretty deeply in supply chain and especially analyzing data crossing supply chain and financial networks, et cetera. So like I said, very aware of the problem, but how would you differ this from, say, EPCIS or existing protocols for exchange of this information kind of cross different parties using standardized REST or other network channels and protocols?
I think the main thing we're concerned about here is that the two networks, they need to conclusively communicate an asset with all security and atomicity properties guaranteed between the two networks. So if the security properties are paramount. So I'm not familiar with the full details of the protocol that you mentioned, but what we are trying to ensure is that when an asset is backed by a network, there is network buy-in to whatever the gateways are doing. So that's actually quite important. So,
I understand that, but like GS1, EPCIS, and other similar protocols in the trade networks, right? I mean, this has been done for years. It's not to say there aren't improvements to be made there, right? But you could still pass all of that metadata along with it. So that's why I'm just trying to get some clarity about what's being added, because it feels extremely complex to be discussing what it inherently is just saying network A has a piece of information they want to share with network B. Right.
Yeah. No, I agree. So the protocols like GS1 are sort of orthogonal to what we are talking about here. We do need a way for the asset information to be interoperable across different systems, and this is something that say folks like Swift are also trying to do. We're trying to have standardized message formats for different kinds of assets, but that's really beyond the scope of what we are trying to do here. We are concerned about the semantics of asset transfer, the semantics of data getting shared between two different ledgers in a way that convinces both the networks behind the gateways that the transaction happens securely and in particular cases like for asset transfer and asset exchange in an atomic manner.
Having that slide back would be helpful, or any of those slides would be helpful.
Yeah, I didn't turn it off.
No, I know. So I guess the question I'm trying to get at is, what does this look like from the network's perspective? And what I mean by this is this. So we have like an existing network, and gateway 1 is attached to the existing network, and gateway 2 is actually, now you attach the network to the gateways in between, right?
Yes.
And so the asset left network 1 and moved to network 2.
Yes.
What does that look like from network 1's perspective? Does it look like it moved to the gateway and then just sits there? Like, what does it look like? Is it like attached to the gateway?
Okay, there are two different ways I can answer this. One, short way, this is what the networks are doing behind the gateways is out of scope for our current working group. But if you want the longer answer, like how we can do this across two different networks, we have built POCs and we have built written papers on this topic. So the networks are supposed to be able to confirm the transaction that the gateways are carrying out. You cannot have the two networks just yeah. You cannot have the two yeah.
I guess I understand the answer.
Yeah.
I guess my point is like the asset was floating around network 1 and it had like ledger things for network 1, and now it has moved to network 2.
Yes.
Does that look like a transfer with no counter? Like what does it look like it's owned by the gateway and then the gateway has the property?
It's not.
Out of scope. It's so many networks. We can't say that.
Okay, what? But once again, this has the protocol.
We need, wait, hold up. Microphone only, okay?
But like, my point is like that. Okay, your job, that what I'm unpersuaded by, and perhaps you'll persuade me later, is that you can take those semantic questions and push them away and say that is only these arrows matter and that everything else is irrelevant. And having like worked in systems, like I'm not persuaded that's the case. So that will be the question I'm going to have at the end of this conversation.
Okay, so just to yeah, I think we are out of time.
Yeah, we are at time for this presentation. If you feel like you're explaining enough use cases, then we can go on. Yeah, we can always come back to it. Okay. Great. So Alex, you will have to, you can actually just turn on your microphone and video. It'll just work.
Yep. Can everybody hear me okay?
You're a little quiet. If you could speak a little louder, that would be good.
Okay. How is now?
I think we can make it work. We'll let you know if it's too quiet. Go ahead.
Okay. Let me just figure out how to share the slides. Or could I ask you to?
So I have them up, and you can just ask me to change, or you can request.
Okay, that's good. All right. Okay, so I'll just start by saying apologies that Martin couldn't be here. So he was my colleague that worked on this. But okay, let's move on. So the Secure Asset Transfer Protocol defines a number of API endpoints, identifiers, and message flows corresponding to the asset transfer between two gateways. You can move on to the next slide, please. So we'll start talking about resource descriptors. Resources can be asset identifiers, public keys, block identifiers, or other such items which are specific to the network. You can move on, please. And here we have an example of what the draft proposes. A new media type will be used, and the protocol is SAT. The organization identifier may be a legal entity identifier or another type of identifier that can link resource ownership to a real-world entity. So the developer or application may validate this entity with the issuing authority. And you can see in this example, we have Quant. The gateway ID is the fully qualified domain name of the SAT compliant gateway. This must resolve to a valid IP address. So here we say api.gateway1.com. It could be anything as long as it's a fully qualified domain name. The next section is the network or system identifier. Sorry, still in the previous one, yeah. So the network or system identifier is specific to the gateway which corresponds to the target network. It is used to direct SAT interactions to the correct network. For example, we have TradeLens or the EU supply chain or Marco Polo, etc. And finally, the resource, as mentioned, specifies, I think I lost the slides.
Yeah, it cut me off again. I don't know why it's doing that. It's not me.
Yeah, we were here. So as I was saying, finally, the resource specifies an item held on the underlying network. This string must be meaningful to the underlying network. So some examples can be a network address, a data block, a transaction ID, an alias, or a future object type not yet defined in the draft. And now we can move on to the next slide. So we move to the core components of the message format. So SAT messages are exchanged between applications and gateways. They consist of protocol negotiations and functional messages. The draft proposes that messages are in JSON format with protocol-specific mandatory fields, support for several authentication and authorization schemes, and support for a free format field for plain text or encrypted payloads. On this slide, we can see the proposed mandatory fields, which are, the SAT protocol version, a unique identifier representing a session, an incrementing sequence number, the SAT phase, a resource URL, a developer URN for the assertion of the developer application identity. We have an action or a response, which is a get or post and arguments. We have a credential profile, which specifies the type of auth used. A credential block, which can have a token, a certificate, or a string. A payload profile, which defines the asset profile and capabilities. An application profile, and this is vendor or application specific. A payload, which is specific for the SAT phase for this message, and a hash of the payload. And finally, we have a message signature, which is the gateway's ECTSA signature over the message. And other relevant attributes may exist that need to be captured for logging purposes, but the draft goes over these in more detail. We can move on to the next slide. Thanks. Next, we would like to summarize the flows proposed by the SAT draft. So these are the transfer initiation flow. So after the identity and asset verification flow, which are out of scope, a sender gateway proposes a session to a receiver gateway. We have the lock evidence verification flow, a conveyance of claims regarding the lock status of a digital asset by one gateway, and the verification of the evidence by the other gateway. And finally, we have the commitment establishment flow, which is the asset transfer and commitment establishment between two gateways on behalf of their respective networks. We can move on. These following slides will outline the flows, but we're mostly going to cover the purpose of the messages. So for the first flow, we have two messages being exchanged, the initialization request message and the corresponding response. The first one, the initialization request message, is sent from the sender gateway to the recipient gateway, and the purpose of it is for the clients to initiate an asset transfer. After receiving this first message, the recipient gateway needs to validate the profiles. If everything is approved, the recipient gateway constructs the response message, and the purpose of this is for the recipient gateway to indicate agreement to actually proceed with the operations. We can move on to the next slide, please. Next, we have this lock evidence verification flow. So this is comprised of 4 message exchanges, so 2 messages and acknowledgements for each of them. The transfer commence message is sent from the sender gateway to the recipient gateway, and it signals that the sender is ready to start the transfer. So it must contain claims related to the information from the previous flow. And the response to this is to indicate agreements to proceed with the asset transfer. Next, we have the lock evidence message, and this is sent by the sender gateway to the recipient, and it conveys the claims of the locking or escrow of the asset on the respective network. And the recipient gateway must validate these claims and then proceed to respond with the lock evidence response message. In this message, the recipient gateway indicates that it accepts the claims of the escrow of the asset from the previous message. We can move on to the next slide. Finally, we have the commit establishment flow. So the commit preparation message has the purpose of indicating its readiness to begin the commitment of the transfer. The response to this message is an indication from the recipient gateway that it is also ready to proceed with the commitment of the with the commitment finalization step. And then we have the commit final message, and this is for the sender gateway to signify that it has completed the local extinguishment of the asset on its network, and the receiving gateway can proceed to regenerate the asset on its corresponding network or system. And the response to this must contain claims that the asset was regenerated on that respective network, in this case for gateway 2 on the picture. And finally, we have the transfer complete message, which is for the sender gateway to indicate that the transfer has been completed and no further messages are to be expected. So that's about it for this brief overview. Of course, the draft covers all of these topics in much more detail. But yeah, thank you for listening.
Okay, so that was the protocol flow. If anybody has clarifying questions about the protocol, really just, how does it work, or questions, not whether it's, appropriate or not, please come now. And then after that, we will do open mic where we can discuss heavily the issues with the entire set of proposals. Any clarifying questions? All right. Hearing none, then we will go on to the real brunt of the day, and we will go back to, let's remind ourselves of the purpose of a BOF, right? So there's a number of things that we've already sort of brought up, and I'm going to reiterate those in a minute, but is the IETF the right place? Is it a tractable problem? All those types of things. I'll note that so far, we've certainly talked about a number of, I think, critical issues. One being, is voluntary or involuntary transfers, which of those two are in scope? Is it tractable to only do voluntary? I think was brought up at one point. When it is voluntary, who's actually doing the request? There seemed to be some confusion about that. Does the asset owner, actually initiate the request? Does the network of the asset owner initiate it? Does the gateway initiate it? How is that, locking mechanism? To some extent, that is in the out of scope section for how the proponents have structured their initial stab at a working group charter. The other big one that was brought up was trust. Really, there's sort of two types of trust that I heard described. One was, inter-network client to gateway. Again, that's sort of declared out of scope. And then there's trust between gateway to gateway. And, it sounded like there was some sort of legal frameworks that might be needed to actually back up, trade memberships and things like that. But the most key question is, can a protocol actually be trusted if we don't define complete end-to-end example now? So that was sort of brought up that if you only define the gateway to gateway now, then you don't get the binding that you get with, trying to deal with how does that work inside of a particular network. So with that, I'll open the floor to, general discussion at this point. Ideally, we'll have time later for a charter, but I think the general discussion will decide whether we should do a charter or not. So who wants to start the discussion? There we go, Ben.
So I think there's a few topics that have come up that seem to me to indicate that we're maybe implicitly making some assumptions about the nature of the networks at the source and recipient ends, in terms of, like, there's some concept of being able to lock an asset or to be able to support an asset disappearing from the network or something like that. And so it might be useful to explore which of these aspects are actually requirements in order to be able to do this at all, or just, and which are just sort of things that are convenient for the current proposed solutions, but not necessarily core aspects of the problem itself. And I don't have an answer to that offhand, so I will drop out of the queue and let someone else go.
I can try to answer that, Ben. So in the protocol itself, there's a thing called a blob called a lock evidence. We just call it lock evidence, right? And what that conveys is evidence that the gateway 1 has somehow disabled temporarily this asset in network 1. And this evidence has to be delivered to gateway 2. And gateway 2 has to read this and assess whether it's acceptable level of locking or disablement. And what that blob is.
Gateway 2 has to know about the network protocol used.
Yes, so in phase 0, gateway 1 has to tell gateway 2, this is my type of network. This is the blob, the locking blob structure that I will use. Do you understand my blob? If you don't, then forget about the transaction. If you do, then proceed, right? And so the question for us right now is, do we define that locking blob? we haven't decided yet. Maybe it's in scope. Right now, I kind of feel it's out of scope because it's just too much work to do. But absolutely great question, because that is one of the core sort of features of that we need to address. What is this evidence blob look like?
Sure. Thanks for the clarification.
Dave?
Okay, Dave Faber. The bottom question on the slide is the working group likely to succeed? And I'm going to answer this from the 5218, what makes for a successful protocol, right? Because you can argue that a working group would be successful if it publishes an RFC. That's not my definition. My definition is the working group is successful if it makes a standard that actually gets deployed and used, okay? And so that's how I'm interpreting that question. And so I'm going to give my thoughts as to how to make it not fail, okay? I mean, by changing the scope, but I can't prove that it will succeed because that requires information I don't have about whether people would actually use it. Where presumably you guys know that better than I do in terms of the use cases.
He can
Yeah, you're right. In his presentation, he actually covered
Alex,
that. Right,
Alex
right,
didn't
right,
tell about
right.
it, but
Yeah. So I'm going to trust you that yes, as long as you do certain things, that people will deploy it. But yeah, I'm looking to yeah. But I would say that as long as you scope things down, I think it's tractable. As long as you scope things down by changing some terminology or maybe changing the scope or whatever wording to still tailor it specifically to the use cases that you walked us through. So for example, if you you either don't mention legal recognition, that'd be option A, or B, scope it to where there's a common agreement within the system of what that legal framework is. And that could be a treaty, it could be a single jurisdiction, whatever it is. As long as there's general agreement on what that means, then you've removed the part that makes it not, one of the parts that makes it not be tractable. Okay? I think within the examples that you showed in the use cases document, I think that assumption holds, but you know better than I do. Okay? So as long as you scope it down to says, okay, there's a common agreement on what legal ownership means, okay, and then you scope it down to say voluntary only, okay, because you could probably do that in the context of a particular definition of what the legal jurisdiction is. All the entities are equal in the same legal jurisdiction, whatever. Then I think that the architecture and the protocol can probably apply. Okay. What I don't know, that was kind of the question that Phil kind of begged, right, was should something, would a legal thing come along and say, if I can't do involuntary, I'll just ban it, right? I can't comment on whether that will happen because I don't know enough. Okay? But as far as taking the architecture, make it be tractable from an engineering point of view, right? Because often engineering principles and legal infrastructures may not be consistent with each other, right? And we're engineers here. Right? So I would scope it down to say, okay, voluntary only, but there's a common understanding of what the legal framework is, okay? And within that narrow scope, then I think it's tractable. Whether it's going to be deployed, I leave that to you and to others to comment on. So thanks.
Closer to the mic, please. And certainly,
Thank you,
you know,
Dave.
one thing that I would love to hear would be, are there other people besides the three proponents that have given presentations that, you know, would want to deploy something like this so that we actually get, you know, so one hand over here, but, two, excellent. Colin.
Actually, those two hands go exactly to mine. I'm actually on the problem need solving, so I'm trying to get my head around this one a little bit more. I'm thinking about that aspect of the BOF. And I get how this would connect the networks. I got your example with the finance network, but you know, the next thing we heard at the mic is, yeah, but that's already a well-solved problem. So I'm trying to get, I think it would help you develop energy and get things here if you could say more about specific use cases that are fairly concrete where this type of technology could help, and particularly ones that weren't already solved today and would be people who really wanted to deploy that. So I don't know if you can comment any more on that now or whether that something happens later, but that's something where I feel like I could learn more, and it would be really compelling to help me understand, like, yeah, this problem needs to be solved. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I can comment on what we have done. So there are things in the pipeline that I can't comment about, but what I can comment about is if you check, you'll find a couple of press releases from last December where we conducted an experimental POC involving the Bank of France and HSBC, where they both have networks built on different technologies. One of them had a network managing CBDC and a coupon payment workflow and securities and stuff like that on a network based on Hyperledger Fabric. Another one had something similar, slightly different workflow, but still managing CBDC and securities assets on the Corda platform. And we built several different use cases connecting the two different networks, be able to atomically exchange assets across each other, to be able to transfer assets from one network to the other, to be able to communicate views of, let's say, a coupon state from one network to the other, things like this. So we did this, and it was perceived to be a success as far as an experiment goes. So in the CBDC world, we're going to see more and more such cases emerging, and if CBDC is going to be a reality, as most governments seem to want to make it so, then this is going to be a necessity, like, very, very soon.
So certainly bringing running code to the table is an excellent thing. Can you describe to the other half of his question, though, which was that why couldn't an existing protocol be used in that situation?
So the thing that we specifically tried to solve, again, giving an example of the system that I am a lead maintainer on, it's called Beaver, and it's about enabling two different decentralized ledger networks to be able to interoperate with each other. So part of that, and really what we're focusing on with SATP, is how do you enable the proxies or spokespersons of two networks to be able to securely communicate either assets or asset state views across each other. That's a part of the bigger scheme. Now, of course, when we're building something for a client, we're going to be doing the whole end-to-end process. So that's really not part of the scope here. But definitely a key part of that is the ability for two gateways of two networks to be able to communicate with each other. And gateways really, I think somebody raised a question earlier, what's the gateway and how do the networks trust involved? We don't have to go into that. But to be able to communicate something institutionally between two networks, you don't need gateway. We cannot dispense with that, whatever kind of protocol we are talking about, whatever use case we are talking about. And so the gate, this is not really a solved problem in the decentralized network space. You have two different decentralized networks. How exactly are they supposed to trust what's happening in the other network? Because in effect, what we're trying to do is enable a cross-network transaction that's spanning two different networks, if you think of it abstractly that way. You need something like this, and it's a problem that we've been trying to solve the past few years, and we have taken a lot of steps towards it. But it's not really the same problem as the classical problem of, let's say, we're using like 2 PCs, 3 PCs. It's not the same problem that we encountered 30 years ago.
Bernie, I don't know if you're remote in the room.
Problem statement and end-to-end and versus gateway to gateway.
Bernie, if that's you talking, you're way too quiet.
Okay.
I don't see his mic line on though. Oh, there he is. Okay. Try again, Bernie.
Okay, is it now better?
Yes, that's better. Thank you.
Okay, sorry. So my question is in the area of like end-to-end and gateway to gateway. As understood, the protocol will be developed gateway to gateway only. Is that does that mean that
Bernie, yeah, can you type the question into the chat, Bernie? You're still very quiet. You could try yelling if you want, but
okay, I'll type it to the chat then.
Okay, thank you. In the meanwhile, I'll read that off in a minute. Roman?
Hi, Roman Uniluk, Carnegie Mellon. Just kind of thinking what you presented both with the use cases and the protocol in particular flow was super helpful. If we think about this as just as a distributed systems problem, and we make the assumption that I think we talked about before, which is the asset is opaque, we're assuming nothing about what's behind the gateway, and we said we need a 3PC and some security. What are the other properties we need to make sure that are baked into the protocol? I mean, I heard a little bit about the locking.
Well, safety and liveness, really. That's the two main things. And for the asset transfer and asset exchange use cases, we need cross-network atomicity.
Sorry,
Move closer to the mic, please.
Atomicity, asset property. So cross-network atomicity. So asset transfer and asset exchange, you need to make sure that if an asset gets burned in one network, it has to get recreated in the other, or it doesn't get burned. And asset swap is either it changes hands in both ways or in neither direction. That's the property one. That's the property we want to make.
And actually, we're asking you guys any other properties we missed, because we say security and liveliness like as a hand sweep, but there might be more. We've been focusing on the asset properties and ended up choosing 3PC instead of 2PC even. 3PC is safer.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Bernie, did you want to try again? I think you came back. You left and came back.
Well, is my audio better now?
No, you're still too quiet.
Okay, I'll
If you
try.
can type it, if you can type it into the chat, I'll read it.
Type it
In the
in chat.
meanwhile, Ecker.
Yeah, we'll scroll up. So I'm concerned we are falling into a trap here, which we often see at IETF, which is a few people interested in something come to us for something which is embedded in a much larger context and which can't be understood without that context. And we don't have that context, and we're asked to define this like very narrow piece. So it's like we're building a rocket, and could you please design the upholstery? And that concerns me. So maybe there are a lot, I look around this room, and I see a lot of people I already know, and I know do not work in this field. And so, like, my question is, like, who are the relevant people I have to in this room for us to actually solve this problem in a reasonable way? And I'm not going to listen to you when you tell me that I don't have to worry about the embedding, because I don't believe that.
But this is why we're going to do a use cases document first.
No, that's not what I mean. Like, you can't work when you are the only pipeline in this community. So the people who are the consumers of this technology have to be here in this room to work through it with us.
So hold on.
Sorry, that's it.
Can I ask a clarifying question?
Yes.
Question. Totally get it, right? And the other thing that people do all the time is they come to the IETF and they bring such a monstrosity that we carve it down into a bare minimum. So, you know, finding that middle line is hard. So do you have a notion in your head of what you think the bare minimum pieces would be in order to, you know, does it include, like, you know, do we need to define inter-network transfers and locking and things like that? I mean, you don't know because it's...
I have no idea because I was completely unable to understand the context.
Okay.
So, like, and it's precisely what I'm saying, is that, like, what is necessary here is the people who are consumers of this technology have to come here and have to work with us to develop it if we're going to develop it. Because otherwise we're developing according to set of requirements, which, not that I don't like you, not that I don't trust you, but they came from you and did not come from the community as a whole. So I invite those people to come to the microphone.
Robert?
So I'm not sure whether the problem's tractable from the way I look at it, and it means that I just think that it needs to have more constraints as to under what scenarios this might fail, and exactly having those listed out and what happens, because that's the thing that I'm most worried about is what's the trust relationship between the two gateways effectively, and if one of them says, actually, I've failed to commit this, can you roll back, for example, what stops that gateway from actually committing that asset to that new network and asking the other gateway to effectively keep it alive, or vice versa, those sorts of questions.
These are exact questions we grapple with. These are good questions.
Because I think that, going back earlier to my comment earlier, is that I think three-phase commit guarantees the asset properties under certain boundary conditions, and in the real world, those sometimes fail. And I think in the real world, when those fail, you have a human come in and has to come and sort things out. So I think if you scope those things down and say, it works in the mainline cases here, these are the cases where things can go wrong and you'll need some out-of-bound way of resolving this, then I think it is tractable. But can you get a network or protocol to solve this and guarantee you make a transactional change between two discrete points in the world at the same time? I think that's that one's no.
This is great input. I do, honestly, yeah, there'll be some point in time in the transaction where a human has to come in, you know, some IT guys, okay, we gotta you know, do something. Yeah, that's a perfectly reasonable, you know, scenario.
Okay. To put it another way, you're sort of asking, where does, like, the legal framework have to take over, you know, to cover the cases where the protocol can't solve, right? That would be another way of looking at it.
Yeah.
Bernie wrote his question, so let me read it. The first presenter mentioned the scope to be only gateway to gateway. Is it meant that the protocol will be designed to only work, you know, gateway to gateway, or will there be room for a possible later extension to make this work end to end? This is relevant example for cases where gateways are hacked.
Right now, it's just gateway to gateway, and when we sort of finish that, you know, it's up to the IETF if, you know, later on you want to extend that to end, you know, originator to beneficiary.
So.
Hi, Philham Baker. I'm not sure that the way that you're scoping it at the moment, taking the networks out completely, depending upon the properties of that network, I think I can simplify the protocol substantially. in that if you have structured cryptography going, that gives you the ability and access to some proofs that otherwise you wouldn't have. So you might not want to do that. But from the point of view of the planet, I am very, very concerned of any action of the IETF that will be seen as endorsing Bitcoin, proof of work, the destruction of our planet. You know, those people are using 1% of the global energy. They've constructed a Ponzi scheme that has destroyed at least $100 billion of wealth,
So,
and is in the and those are relevant when it comes to if the IETF starts a working group that may be that is going to be used as a way of endorsing that whole field. And I think that the IETF has to be very careful before it takes any step that would be interpreted in that way.
certainly interpretation brings an interesting question, but I'll note that we already have invented something that has helped Bitcoin and other, realms work, right? It's called TCP. They're communicating their transactions over it. So the point of this group was to transfer digital assets, and yes, it could be misused for something that we don't like. And I'm in your camp otherwise. But, Michael.
So, sorry, just to add to Philip's question, just for an answer. I think during our conversations for the drafts and everything, we knew there were networks like Bitcoin or Ethereum, which have this sort of negative impact on the world at the moment. But you'll notice that in our use cases, and mostly in our conversation as well, we focus on networks based on technologies such as Hyperledger Fabric or Corda, or even other things which are more on the permission side of networks rather than permissionless. But let's not go into that direction necessarily, but it's just that I think this is something that we should keep in mind indeed when it comes to this protocol.
Just to add to that, the whole problem of fragmentation and the need to communicate assets arises because of we have so many permission networks that are actually doing things which we already did in the real world. They're just trying to digitize processes that were sort of manual in the past. So that's really what we're trying to
Yeah, Michael Perrock here again. Just wanted to get some clarity because I think, for sure, I look at the general BOF goals, see for sure, yes, problem needs solving, right? It's something I encounter constantly, right? But one of the clarity things for me is every example you've given has been either Hyperledger or some, DLT type approach, et cetera. Is this intended to work across the board regardless of that? Is that kind of what you're saying?
That's why the networks are out of scope for us. I know you talked about Hyperledger, but no, I don't get Hyperledger or Fabric or anything. But
well, I mean, what about just like a traditional database, right?
Yes.
Or something else, right? A flat file,
that's right.
And that's why
No, that's a good question. So we want to make it so that, in fact, instead of a network, it could be a monolithic database on one side.
Okay.
That G2 doesn't know that it's actually a database as opposed to just a network.
That might be helpful to bring into the examples because if we are talking, because so much has come back to like DLT type, or ledger type examples and things like that. And obviously there has to be some bridge between that kind of stuff because that stuff is out there, right? It may not go away overnight. It may never go away. We don't know.
Actually, Alex, I know Martin has explained in some of the meetings prior to this that in fact these guys in the UK have a deployed solution. And one side is in fact a monolithic sort of banking computer. It's not even a.
Okay, that's helpful. Have you thought through things like decentralized identifiers, which are now a spec and things like that, right? Because
Sure.
There are aspects touching on this in other standards orgs, also aspects. I mean, I'm looking at this and going, well, why wouldn't I just make a bunch of JOTs or CWTs, right? Yep. Exchanging these claims.
Come and join us and
excellent.
Yeah, seriously. These are the sequence of questions, the corollary questions that are adding up, and we're like, okay, this is a lot of work.
we add, again, the reason why the examples focused on decentralized ledger networks is because it's strictly speaking, a newer and a harder problem to solve. That's really
So, Martin Thompson, I'm looking at these questions here, and these are good questions. These are the usual questions, so unsurprising. Bernie asked a question about end-to-end, and that was very quickly waved out of scope. The discussion here, we talked about locking and various other things, and being able to assert to your counterparty that you have a lock on the thing that's being transferred. That to me suggests that the scope is a lie. I have a very hard time believing that you can implement something like this by putting that stuff out of scope when it is so fundamental to the protocol here that we're talking about delivering. But I don't want you to answer that question. I think that until we've dealt with the question of constituency, none of this matters very much. So I see a few people here who are interested in pushing this forward, but I'm not seeing evidence that the people who would be deploying it are here in the room, and that concerns me. So the point Eka made earlier, until that is answered, I think that the third question and the sixth question have answers of no right now.
So if any of the people that are interested in deploying this want to speak to their particular environment, that would certainly be helpful at this point. I invite them to come to the microphone.
Yeah, what do you call it? My phone isn't working with the authorization thing,
That's
so
fine. Can you
I
state your
can't.
name and affiliation then?
I'm Rebecca. I'm with 14 BIS. We deal with supply tracking, and we mostly deal with, at the moment, hybrid assets. So basically, like actual parts that have like, IDs associated with them, and ownership is like digitally recorded. And like a lot of times, currently with the clients we manage, like it's everything is on like a Hyperledger like Fabric network, and everything is internal. But we can see like in the future, if like, for example, our clients are transferring assets that we did not create for them, for example, like off another client of theirs like network, this could be something that's like interesting to us, and we would want to establish a protocol. Obviously we would have to work with however their clients like are dealing with how they handle like their own assets and data, and we would have to build a specific set of rules for our gateways. But this is definitely something we're interested in.
Great, thank you very much.
Hi, I'm John Robotham. I'm with Ernst & Young, and we deal with these problems of either permissioned blockchains talking to other permission blockchains, or permissionless ones talking to permissionless, or you name the combinatorics. These are our critical problems. I would also point out that a fair amount of the theft going on right now in permissionless blockchains happens at the gateways. That's usually the vector of attack. So these things, what we're talking about here, I'm actively participating in this working group, and I think it's very important for us in both financial and supply chain kinds of applications.
Okay, thank you. Do you have a deployment case too? Go ahead. For those with general comments, please do use the Q button on the phone if possible.
Apologies, I also have an authentication challenge. Ori Steele with the Transmute. I work in the digital identifier cryptographic assertion space, and involved both in permissionless and permission blockchain technology. Agree with the comments John made regarding where we see fraud and attacks in the space, on the endpoints. Certainly a concern. Certainly the industry will solve for atomic swap blockchain interoperability between networks awkwardly by itself, in absence of guidance from a group of folks who've organized to create, clarity. I don't know how much representation it's my first time at IETF. I'm not sure how many financial institutions come to these kinds of meetings to provide input, but they are relevant to the questions, on the screen. I think my main interest in this work is sort of seeing cyber physical supply chain cases. So you mentioned some of the hybrid physical digital cases. Seeing folks coming together, thinking more about those use cases is important to my business. And, we intend to deploy technologies that support providing physical supply chain traceability, but also non-physical digital supply chain, software supply chain use cases. I think there's a good amount of overlap in some of the pieces that you've proposed. I also think it is a challenging space, and that scoping is very hard in this space. So I'm not sure how useful any of that is, but I support the attempt to create some order in the space.
Thank you, Michael.
Yes, so Michael Prorock, Measure.io, definitely willing to participate in such a working group if it comes to play. Once again, though, noted, like, here be dragons, right? And I think towards Ori's note, this stuff is going on. Like, we see this actively. I do a lot of work in, everything from human trafficking to looking at forced labor and stuff like that. And we see illicit transactions over these networks, as well as occasionally legitimate transactions outside of the, permission type stuff, right, in private networks. So it is something where we have to get some kind of structure and order on it, if for no other reason than to understand what's going on and to enable some kind of regulation around this stuff. So it's definitely something willing to participate in, willing to make sure we're coding in accordance with standards should they emerge out of this stuff. So it's so definite support, understand the problem set, but it's a dangerous area for sure for a lot of reasons. So
thank you. Eric?
Jokes it out.
So the last thing you said was the most important one, I think. So I guess I'd love to hear from Ori and you and other people. If the IETF produces a standard in this space, will that bring order, or will that be XKCD 927? And I don't know, but I want to hear about it.
Yeah.
Well, and more importantly, do recognize for the proponents that when you bring stuff to the IETF, it can change, right? You don't,
Yeah, and I'll follow up on that, and Eric, and I think that's an excellent question, and is part of my concern. Like, I think the change actually is a good thing, because I think bringing strong technical merit that's internet interested, cross-boundary, that's important. What I'm not sure on is, have we actually defined the scope well enough to actually sit down and write about this? I am not 100% convinced that IETF putting a standard on this will be very helpful unless everyone actually follows the standard, right? Or we see a large degree of adoption. And this is one of the things that we see supply chain wise, and it's come up in other conversations at IETF, just thinking about things like FAA, right? And exchange of information around drones and other types of things. When you start getting into these international boundary type questions, sure, it's great if everyone's respecting, some North American model or North America plus Europe, et cetera, but the world is much, much bigger than that, right? And so if we're only seeing a partial buy-in from this, that's concerning. This goes a bit to, is the IETF the right place to solve it? And I am personally not 100% sure of that, right? I think from the technical side and defining these protocols, maybe, but these network protocols for exchanging information in an ACID type way, they kind of exist, right? So that's a little bit of the concern I have, is maybe this is more of a regulatory and a policy question. Maybe this is an ISO thing, et cetera. And I'm not 100% sure yet, but I'm highly interested in the area.
I mean, the reason why it's IETF, it's kind of the home of interoperability, and it's an open forum, right? So I don't have to pay so many $1 million to join some industry consortium, right? And the specs are going to be, open to anyone.
Well, and the paid aspect, right, is a highly concerning thing, right? So many of these things masquerade as standards or interop things, and then in reality, it's just pay to play. We see that in agriculture all the time. Like, oh yeah, we've got such and such going on, but in reality, all you're doing is charging the farmer a bunch of money for very little value. So if we can break that with a totally open, non-proprietary standard, cool. But if that just defines something so people can masquerade and say they're doing interop, that concerns me as well, right?
Just want to comment on where this is being used or applied. So at least under the Hyperledger umbrella, the flagship, there's a interoperability project called Cactus, and then we have our project under Hyperledger Labs called Weaver. These are two most mature interoperability projects for permissioned blockchains, really, because that's the point of view we were coming from. And within Cactus, you already have an implementation of the ODAP protocol that was talked about here. And we've been building this concept of using gateways to communicate views as well as exchange assets or transfer assets, and we intend to comply with whatever protocol is agreed upon by the working group. So, and in the recent past, we've had basically every week we have a lot of meetings with Cactus, Weaver, with the EEA, with other various big players in the blockchain world, and everybody is interested in this. Everybody wants a solution.
Okay, let's go on to the last couple of comments, and then I'm going to bug Roman and Paul. Heads up.
So it's Ori Steele from Transmute. I'm queued to respond to Eric. I think you'd know better than I would how the IETF might handle a situation like this proposal. The only thing I can say is that given the nature of the problem, I think engagement, international engagement from regulators, banks, financial institutions, and technology developers would all be critical. And it should be observable that they're there to participate in the work, and that if those constituents are there and they're engaged and they're contributing to the work and their contributions are visible, I believe the IETF can produce interoperable standards that address the financial industry's needs for transport protocols. However, I'm not sure we're fully seeing them, enough of them here today. I don't know what the criteria for sort of observing the presence of those kinds of entities, but I think seeing regulators stepping up to the mic, saying things like, we'd like to participate, we'd like to comment, we'd like to see, my naive perspective on it is I would like to see their comments on the proposal.
Hi, Stu Card. I've got lots of different affiliations, but for this time, I'm going to wear the one that will paint a target on my back in this audience. A little startup called Quotidian Engineering and Development, which is explicitly a distributed ledger technology startup. I've been involved since the days of the cypherpunks in 1993. I think before this work can effectively be addressed, use case. The first use case that I was involved in is I have the sad honor of consuming the most expensive bag of popcorn in history, which I bought with Bitcoin from a vending machine that was prototyped by one of my co-inventors. My use case here is in publicly, in a non-repudiatable way, recording attestations of properties of software distributions. So I think that's a valid use case for blockchains. But anyway, to see this addressed, to see this addressed in the IETF, we have to first off take on the visceral response that it generates amongst IETFers. If you say blockchain, you just painted a big honking target on yourself. And part of that is legitimate because proof of work is evil, okay? But proof of scope, I'm not sure is the answer. Proof of stake, I'm not sure is the answer either, right? We need to think about why is it that blockchain technology causes such a visceral response in IETFers, and unless we address that, right, this community is not going to be very welcoming to this kind of work.
So let me claim this famous coinage. Bitcoin turns very good engineers into very lousy speculators. so that's TM Thomas, all right? So no, absolutely agree. This technology is here to stay in some form or another. It's going to evolve, and I believe the IETF needs to step to the plate and say, yeah, we can address some parts of this intra problem at the very minimum. And it's almost like, well, if the IETF is not going to do it, who else is going to do it? Because each of these communities, they're still stuck on like designing their own internal networks and basically promoting their own tokens. Okay, and this is back to the engineers as speculators, right? So that's why we came to the IETF, because I think this is the home of interop. I've been telling, now just to give you a picture, there's a whole generation of under, 25s who don't know the IETF produced TCP/IP, TLS, IPsec, X509. They've never heard of the IETF before. And this is a problem, not for me, it's like everybody. And I think this is a good, this sort of kind of work is a good entryway for people to say, well, yeah, we've got the engineering know-how. We can do it too, and we'll do it better with good design engineering principles.
All right, thank you all. I will say that the right magic words are Merkle tree. IETF has used Merkle trees a lot. You have to couch it properly. Roman and Paul. So I have 20 minutes left. We have some, I think, options about what would be most useful to you two to make a decision in the long run. We can start doing polling now, or next up technically on the agenda was a charter discussion, but it feels like we might want to preempt that with usability and other stuff. So we'll let them confer in their developed Merkle tree's head. So give us 1 minute while we pause for a moment. I will note that I did pull up some of the, actually, while they're thinking, I will put up some of the proposed charter. So you can read a couple of sentences while we're waiting. David?
Any chance I could make a comment while we're waiting?
Yep, go ahead.
Thanks. David Skenazy, Internet Architecture Enthusiast. So just to respond to some of the points here before, the main question that I'm noodling on is whether the IETF is the right place for this. Because the IETF has some advantages in that, yeah, it's free, but so is GitHub, and it has some IPR policies which are great, and it has some credibility. But then the question is, like we were saying, there seems to be some use cases that make sense. But at the same time, the optics of us enabling technologies that folks have concerns about could damage the credibility of the IETF. And that is somewhat of a concern that is worth taking into consideration. So I don't really have a question for you. It's just, I think that should be part of our decision on whether we want to adopt this work, on what the consequences would be long term.
Yeah, well, the interesting thing, there's also an enhancement to the credibility in some people's eyes too, and how do you weigh those two things? But yes, that's a good point. Thank you, David.
If I can add to that comment, so I've been working with blockchains for the past like 5 to 6 years, and I've started with Ethereum and Bitcoin, but then moved on to more refined, you could say, networks. And each of them is evolving on top of the past one. So if Bitcoin was very, disruptive, but also destructive, you have Ethereum, which you can take into a private consortium and build something amazing with it without any of the environmental concerns, just because of how, how capable the technology is to adapt. But the problem with these networks, developing on them, I had to learn 10 different APIs to be able to interact with all of these. And none of them have any standards between each other. It's very hard to take what you learn from one network and sort of say, okay, this is similar to this other one. And the problem that all of these networks face is that they sort of, especially the permissionless ones, they sort of have this ego that it should be decentralized. There's no governing authority in this blockchain space, especially and also in networks. So I think a group like IETF, which is worldwide and has this sort of it's not a single entity. It's multiple companies coming together. This would be like a perfect use case, I think, for an institution like this, an organization like this. Yeah, thank you.
All right, Roman, are you? Let me table you for 1 second. See if you guys are done. Okay, I'm gonna let them jump first. I need to answer their question.
Okay, Paul, City. So the question is, can you talk a bit, like a couple of minutes about the charter and see if that gives us more clarity about answering one of the first two questions of the BOF about whether this is the right place and whether this is a problem we can solve.
Yep, as I said, that was actually my next plan. So Colin, did you have?
I'll make this really brief. I think the IETF should be very hesitant about not doing work because of a value judgment about how it will be used. A ton of the use cases I heard were permission block change, which probably have very low energy impact on the world. Obviously, there's some use cases that have very high energy impact. But if we start going down that path, there is no end to it. And, you know, it sure is a good thing we didn't invent the SHA hash. I mean, you know, think about that for a second, right? I really think that that's a slippery slope that we have no way as an organization of picking the right place to be down that slippery slope. So I expect individuals to decide whether they contribute and work in the area or not based on their own decision point about that. But I don't think that that is one of our criteria for choosing working groups particularly. And yeah, I agree with David completely. We should think about that. Maybe I'm totally wrong. But my point of view is that's probably not, that's a very dangerous criteria for us to go down because tons of our stuff is used for all kinds of off-hub military operations and everything else, right? Like you look at what our stuff is used for, you get much more dicey than you think.
Yep, I agree. All right, so in order to dive down the scope thing a little bit, I do have a couple of slides on the draft scope that was floated around by the proponents and on the mailing list, and so I'm going to let you read those. But basically, you know, one of the things is that it is supposed to, you know, make use of existing IETF technologies that, you know, we are familiar with, like TLS and JSON and object containers and things like that, as well as encryption protocols and digital certificates and other stuff. Ecker, one sec. Although the immediate focus is on unidirectional, they have scoped it down to be unidirectional, but I think even some of their examples sort of pointed toward the bidirectional needs. Again, that was scoping it to get it down to a single place. With respect to what is the scope, right? So API endpoint definitions, they didn't define that super well in the presentations, but it is in the documents in terms of the gateways have an API to interact between the gateways, and there's a gateway API inside that is sort of at the out of scope side. The resource identifiers, you know, as people noted, that people may want to change how the identifier actually looks. That's for the working group to do. The message flows and payloads, again, those are very high level presentations. The documentation is actually quite a bit longer. And then of course, you know, there's some terminology work. And the milestones that were listed were, you know, a use cases document, sounds like 6 months because they already have done a lot of work in that space. For anybody that is going to do deployments or would consider it, I think, you know, the proponents would love your particular use cases spelled out too, so that we can make that stronger. There's an architecture document and a protocol document. That is the sort of the charter in a nutshell. There's some background stuff that I skipped over. Eric? And so one of my questions is this too small, right? Because I think you in particular very much hinted that the scope is so small that you can't wrap your head around it because you need the bigger picture.
Well, I was hoping to go back to the first slide.
That one?
No, the ones that said verifiable asset transfer, I believe. Blah blah blah. Okay, can you start me at the start and just go forward, and then I'll tell you when to stop.
Yep. No.
Maybe you can't, because there's definitely isn't the start. So
my computer freaked out. Just ignore it. I didn't see anything that said verifiable asset transfer.
I was
Verifiable by third parties?
could be. But I just want to look at that slide for a minute. Well, first of all, these numbers are fantasy. Can we just pretend like 6, 12 months is like banana pants? Like we all know that, right? Well, slide 1 maybe. This is slide 8.
That's slide 1.
Yeah, 2, 3. I'm just going. 4. Fantastic. 4 pretty good. This is what I want. Okay, good. I don't know what this means. And this is actually really important. I know it seems like I'm nitpicking, but it's really important because one of the key descriptions, and this goes to the scope of the question, is one of the key descriptions of the DLTs is to provide double spending protection. And so is double spending protection in scope or out of scope for this problem?
So if the asset properties are fulfilled, then you should not have double spending. That's why we talk about acidity, acid versus double spend.
But I don't think that's correct because you have three networks, A, B, and C. And what stops A from allegedly transferring to B and then to C?
So this is why you have gateways, and the gateways have the commitment, and you have the legal behind the gateway.
Okay, but then that's not third-party verifiable. That's my point. So
Hang on. So third party means that if there's any disputes, a lawyer can come in and say, show me evidence on your network, show me evidence on network 2, and we'll resolve this. This is what it has to be verifiable by a human being if there's a dispute.
Okay, then this is going to require some more fleshing out here because, okay. Well, yes, so I do think this is too small, but I think I've said as much as I can say about that already.
One of the interesting things to me is that, I'll let you go ahead and then I'll rephrase.
Or Steele from Transmute. My understanding is it's sort of attempting to solve for the double spend problem through a legal enforcement mechanism, as I read it today.
Fair enough. So maybe you could clarify. That's why it's a proposed charter. That's fine. But this is good input, by the way. Yeah.
Okay, so right now, the scope of work and the sort of the charter, these are the two important things, right? This is what will be done, and then there's the 3 deliverables. I think the initial question before we ask, the standard BOF questions is there anything that should be added or removed, from these 2 of the most important lists? And text about is the background description right and things like that is certainly subject to debate. I'll note that, the one oddity for me in this whole endeavor is that we do have a case of a potential IETF protocol that has some integrated legal frameworks that are sort of necessary for the protocol to work well. I actually don't think this is the only case where that might be, but I was struggling to find the other ones. I think
I can give you another example. So X509 certs issued by a CA. There's a long CSP it's a legal document. It's got warranties, and if the CA screws up, you sue the CA. That's illegal. You send in the lawyers. I mean, that's what they do in the real world.
Yeah. And that was the one that I think was most tangential to me, especially with proof of CA's issuing stuff. Go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, quick clarifying question, should some existing thing already exist for one of these items? I mean, is it a potential outcome to just say, nope, we're going to go point at that other standard? And you hinted that with the terminology, and if I didn't see NISTR and ISO on there for those things,
Actually,
I'd be really worried.
We actually want more vendors. Yeah, please.
Yes, that seems like a good mailing list topic, et cetera.
This is like the obvious one. You just Google it. And ISO is the other obvious one. But yeah, please send us some more stuff.
Yeah, I think the proponents are very open to help. All right, so I don't see any more questions, which brings us to, given our understanding of the problem space today and giving our understanding of the proposed scope and deliverables, we should go back to ask sort of the more standard, BOF questions. I think the first is, what is the sense of the room? And I guess I should use the hands tool in order to show of hands tool. So let me live write. You guys won't be able to see it, but I'll read it as I'm typing. Is the problem space well understood? Is that a sufficient one? Any objections to that wording? We're good at objections. All right. So I'm going to start the session. Please raise your hand if the problem space is well understood. Do not raise your hand if the problem space is not. If you're not going to use the tool, you're welcome to raise your hand in the room if you think the problem space is well understood.
Question is scope on the question. Well understood by this room or well understood in the world?
This room.
Okay, the world evolves.
Still seeing a few more votes creep in, but it's looking pretty clear at this point.
I only just had it clear on my machine, so it might be.
All right, so for the note taker, we have 11 hands raised and 34 not raised. which indicates that the problem space, 35 not raised, the problem space is not super well understood. Which does not mean that the work couldn't happen, but it does make it more challenging if we don't come to agreement on what the problem space actually is. I think that the other big one that came out of this discussion is the IETF the right standards body to take on this work? So I will start that queue. And I recognize I'd have a hard time answering this question myself. So. I like watching people change your mind. There's people that have switched back and forth.
Well, I keep clicking on the output of the result of the poll instead of the input to the poll.
Phil, I can help you. All right, I think we'll call that good. So for the note taker, that was 24 hands raised and 20 not raised, with a slight leaning toward actually the IETF might be the right place to actually conduct this work. 25 to 19, last minute change, okay. The queue has been cut. So the next question, I think, would be recognizing that we don't agree necessarily the problem space is well defined. This next question is going to be hard to answer, but it is still sort of the right next question, which is the scope of the proposed charter
I'm waiting.
I know.
The scope of what charter is.
You ever authored questions live? It's good fun. Is the scope of the proposed charter, I don't want to say sufficient. I don't want to say too small or too, it really needs two questions, but I didn't want to do that.
Correct. Viable.
Sufficient to start a working group.
Satisfactory.
Yeah.
I'll have a cookie for sufficient to start a working group.
Oh, they're in the Meet Echo room, so you have to go into Meet Echo. Either you can do it on your phone, you can go enter the Meet Echo room on your phone using the QR code that was up, or there's a link. You can also do it on a computer, and it gives you the full thing.
Yes, I always have.
All right, that's looking pretty stable. So that is 13 raised their hands and 32 did not raise their hands. So that to me sees that there's probably a scope question that would require some work with the ADs in order to come up with a scope that was actually better, or possibly another BOF. Roman and Paul, what other questions would you like to have answered?
So it seems like we need some more discussion, and maybe another BOF, or maybe some more communication between the parties before we move on. Does that seem?
It does. So, I mean, the one thing to recognize is I had the mailing list up there earlier. It's standard IETF mailing list, mailman, Satp, if you want to get involved and be part of the discussions. I suspect that the authors have gotten a lot of good feedback today, regardless of the outcome of the BOF and whether a working group is formed. You can see where some of the holes in terms of knowledge that people need in order to find it a tractable problem. But the interesting thing to me is what's the right scope, because some people would want more, some people would want less, and that's always the hard line to walk.
Yeah, I think I agree with what you're saying.
Okay. All right, so I think with that, we will declare this BOF done, and thank you to the presenters for bringing your problem space to us, and it's an interesting one, so.
That is a great question. I don't really know. I suspect that the data tracker does have a profile, and there's a way to update the data tracker. Yeah, you can't update it. Sorry, I do know I got my. The secretary took photos of me and put them there for me. They do want to. Yes, that's how I got it. Okay. Okay.
But if you send them a picture, they can most
Okay. I guess I should look into I'll just send it. You know, there's a system you have to.
So they didn't think much of the